November 1st, 1943, Empress Augusta Bay, Bougainville. The volcanic sand felt coarse beneath Sergeant Milan Gravich's boots as he crouched behind a makeshift defensive position, watching the jungle tree line for any sign of Japanese movement. In his hands rested something that should not have existed outside an aircraft, something that regulations never intended for ground combat. The weapon looked like it had been assembled in a workshop by someone who cared more about results than proper channels. An aircraft machine gun stripped from a crashed dive bomber now fitted with a crude bipod attachment still bearing. The smell of welding torch and improvisation. When the Japanese attacked 2 days into the campaign on November 3rd, 1943, Gravich's improvised weapon would fire at a rate that seemed impossible for a ground-based gun, spitting out rounds at velocities no standard Marine machine gun could match. What Gravich did not know in that moment was that this unauthorized modification, born from frustration and necessity, would evolve into one of the most devastating infantry weapons of the Pacific War. This weapon would help turn the tide on the bloodiest beach in Marine Corps history, where more American blood would soak into volcanic sand than at any other battle in the Pacific theater. The journey to that moment began with a problem that plagued every Marine rifle company in the Pacific, a problem written in the blood of Marines who died waiting for adequate fire support. The standard M1919, a 6 Browning machine gun, while reliable, was a beast. 32 pounds of steel that required multiple men to transport effectively. Its rate of fire, approximately 400 to 550 rounds per minute, provided suppressive fire, but lacked the overwhelming firepower needed to quickly neutralize Japanese pillboxes and fortified positions. Marines watched their comrades fall while waiting for their machine guns to be repositioned. Reloaded, brought forward. The weapon was adequate for defensive positions, excellent when mounted on vehicles or in fixed emplacements, but woefully inadequate for the rapid infantry assaults that characterized Pacific Island fighting. In the dense jungles and across the volcanic beaches where Marines fought, mobility meant survival and firepower meant victory. The M1919, a 6, offered neither in sufficient measure. The tactical reality of Pacific combat created specific demands that existing weapons simply could not meet. Japanese defensive positions were masterfully constructed, using the natural terrain and volcanic rock to create mutually supporting fields off fire. A single pillbox properly positioned and camouflaged could pin down an entire Marine platoon. The standard response required coordinated action. Machine guns would lay down suppressive fire while demolition teams maneuvered close enough to destroy the position with satchel charges or flamethrowers. But this coordination took time, and time cost lives. The M1919, a 6's relatively modest rate of fire meant that Japanese defenders could time their movements between bursts, maintaining defensive fire even while under suppression. Marines advancing across open ground needed their machine guns to deliver such overwhelming volume of fire that defenders literally could not raise their heads to return fire. The M1919A6 could not deliver this level of suppression. The weapon's weight compounded the problem. At 3212 lb+, the weight of ammunition, spare barrels, and the tripod mount, a machine gun section required at least 3 men to operate effectively. In the fluid combat of island warfare, where Marines might advance several hundred yards only to be pinned down by hidden positions, repositioning a heavy machine gun under fire was extraordinarily difficult and dangerous. Individual Marines understood this problem intimately, felt it in their bones every time they watched the machine gun section, struggling to keep pace with the advancing rifle platoon. They understood that their survival often depended on fire support that arrived seconds too late, delivered with insufficient volume to effectively suppress entrenched defenders. Milan Grevich understood this problem better than most. Born in Minnesota on May 24, 1924, he had joined the Marine Corps with a machinist's understanding of how things worked, how they could be improved. His pre-war civilian training had given him hands-on experience with metal fabrication, with understanding tolerances and stress points, with the practical knowledge of how to modify existing equipment to perform new functions. When Grevich volunteered for the newly formed Marine Parachute Battalions, he brought with him not just physical courage, but mechanical ingenuity. The Paramarines were an experiment, an elite unit designed to drop behind enemy lines and wreak havoc. They trained harder, fought fiercer, and thought differently than conventional Marines. The parachute battalions attracted Marines who wanted the hardest challenges, who sought out the most demanding training, who believed that light units required elite soldiers. The training regime was deliberately brutal, designed to weed out anyone who lacked the physical stamina or mental toughness for airborne operations. Those who survived the selection process formed tight-knit units characterized by initiative, adaptability, and a willingness to question conventional approaches. This culture of innovation would prove crucial when Grevich encountered his first AN-M2 aircraft machine gun during the Bougainville campaign. The Paramarines were encouraged to innovate to find solutions where regulations saw only obstacles. Officers in the parachute battalions understood that elite troops operating behind enemy lines would face situations that no manual could address, that survival and mission success would depend on the ability to improvise and adapt. This institutional culture created the environment in which Thestinger could be conceived. In a conventional Marine unit, a sergeant modifying government property without authorization might face court-martial. In the Paramarines, that same sergeant's initiative might be rewarded with approval and support. The AM-2 represented everything the M1919A6 was not. Where the ground gun weighed 32 lbs, the aircraft version weighed just 21 lbs. This remarkable weight reduction was achieved through fundamental redesign rather than simple material substitution. The engineers at Fabry National had created the weapon specifically for aircraft use where every ounce mattered for payload capacity and fuel efficiency. The barrel walls were significantly thinner than those of ground-based machine guns. The receiver was manufactured from lighter materials with reduced safety margins. In a ground weapon, these modifications would be catastrophic, leading to rapid barrel failure and potentially dangerous malfunctions. But aircraft machine guns operated in a completely different environment. Barrel revelation was its rate of fire. Where the standard ground machine gun fired 400 to 550 rounds per minute, the AM-2 could achieve 200 to 500 rounds per minute. This incredible cyclic rate was possible because aircraft machine guns were cooled by the high-velocity slipstream of flight. At cruising speeds, air rushing past the weapon carried away heat faster than it could accumulate, allowing the thin barrel to sustain rates of fire that would melt a ground-based weapon within seconds. The weapon had been designed for rear-facing defensive positions on dive bombers and patrol aircraft, where gunners needed maximum firepower in brief engagements against attacking fighters. In aerial combat, engagements lasted seconds. A gunner might have only a 3 or 4 second window to hit an attacking aircraft before it broke off or completed its attack. In those brief moments, volume of fire mattered more than sustained fire capability. The AM-2's original configuration reflected its intended use. Spade grips designed for standing gunners using both hands. Solenoid triggers activated by electrical switches for synchronized fire through propeller arcs. Mounts designed to traverse quickly in confined aircraft turrets. None of these features translated well to ground combat, but the fundamental performance characteristics offered revolutionary potential for infantry use. By late 1943, aircraft machine guns were becoming surplus equipment in the Pacific theater, as American air superiority grew increasingly dominant as fighter aircraft mounted heavier 50 caliber weapons and 20 mm cannons. The 30 caliber defensive weapons became obsolete. The strategic bombing campaign required heavy defensive armament, but fighter superiority meant that bomber formations faced fewer attacks, reducing the need for defensive guns. Damaged aircraft were cannibalized for parts throughout the Pacific Islands. Crashed planes littered beaches and jungles across the theater. Aircraft that sustained damage beyond economical repair were stripped of useful components before being abandoned or destroyed. Among these components were AM-2 machine guns designed for aircraft but now available to anyone with the ingenuity to envision alternative uses. Enterprising Marines like Private William Colby from Gloversville, New York began to see opportunity where regulations saw only scrap metal. During the early days of the Bougainville campaign, Colby salvaged an AM-2 from a crashed aircraft. His modification was crude but functional. He left the awkward spade grips intact, but added a bipod to the muzzle end, creating a hybrid weapon that combined aircraft firepower with minimal ground stability. When Japanese forces attacked his position on November 3, 1943, Colby deployed his modified weapon with devastating effect. Fed ammunition by his assistant gunner, Private Edward Crumlish, he repelled the assault with firepower that shocked both sides. The weapon overheated quickly without the cooling effect of aircraft slipstream. It lacked any proper stock for aiming, making accurate fire difficult. The spade grips were awkward for a prone gunner. But despite these limitations, it worked. The psychological impact on Japanese attackers was immediate and profound. Throughout the Pacific War, Japanese soldiers had grown accustomed to the rhythmic fire of American machine guns. The Browning's distinctive sound and cadence were familiar, almost predictable. Attackers learned to time their movements, to advance during pauses, to seek cover when fire intensified. Cole's modified aircraft gun shattered this learned behavior. The rate of fire was so high that it produced not the familiar rhythmic bursts, but a continuous roaring tear, like fabric being ripped apart at enormous scale. Japanese attackers who attempted their usual tactics found themselves caught in fire that seemed to fill the air itself, that left no gaps for movement, that created an almost solid wall of lead. Grevich watched KBY's improvised weapon in action, and saw not just a field modification, but the beginning of something revolutionary. The crude nature of Cole's conversion actually highlighted the weapon's potential. If this barely modified aircraft gun could produce such devastating results, what might be possible with a proper conversion designed specifically for infantry use? Together with Private First Class John Little, Grevich began work on what would become the first true Stinger machine gun. They started with an AM-2 that had been brought ashore at Empress Augusta Bay, likely salvaged from damaged aircraft or obtained through the informal supply networks that existed between Marine ground units and Navy aviation personnel. The spade grips, designed for aircraft gunners using both hands in a standing position, were clearly useless for infantry work. A prone infantryman needed a trigger. He could operate with one hand while maintaining his grip on the weapon and sight picture. Grevich fabricated a trigger mechanism from sheet metal, crude in appearance but functional in operation. The design was simple by necessity, a mechanical linkage that transferred finger pressure to the weapon's firing mechanism. For a stock, they cut down an M1 Garand rifle butt stock. The Garand stock was solid walnut, designed to withstand the considerable recoil of the 306 cartridge, but it was also precisely shaped to fit the human shoulder and cheek. offering the kind of stable shooting platform that the aircraft gun lacked. Grevich carefully hollowed out the stock to accept the unique shape of the aircraft machine gun's buffer tube, a painstaking process that required precision cutting to maintain the stock's structural integrity while achieving proper fit. From a Browning automatic rifle, they took the bipod and rear sight. These components offered multiple advantages beyond their functional capabilities. Every Marine was already trained on the bar, already familiar with its sight picture and bipod deployment. Using these components meant the Stinger would feel familiar despite its revolutionary performance, reducing training time and making the weapon more intuitive for Marines transitioning from standard weapons. The bipod provided front-end stability crucial for controlling the weapon's high rate of fire. The bar sight offered aiming capability superior to the original aircraft sights, which had been designed for aerial gunnery. Wear-point shooting and tracer observation mattered more than precision aiming. The Airsoft was a weapon unlike anything in the Marine Corps arsenal. 40 in long, 25 Willoughby, fully configured, belt-fed with a 100-round ammunition box. It looked cobbled together because it was an amalgamation of 3 different weapon systems held together by ingenuity and necessity. The aesthetic was purely functional, lacking the refined lines of factory-produced weapons. Welds were visible. The stock showed obvious modification. The trigger mechanism looked improvised because it was, but function mattered more than form, and when Grevich test-fired the weapon, the results exceeded even his optimistic expectations. The cyclic rate remained close to the original aircraft specification, somewhere between 1,200 and 500 rounds per minute. In practical terms, this meant the Stinger could deliver 3 times the volume of fire as the M1919A6. A 3-second owned burst would send approximately 70 to 75 rounds downrange. The standard 100-round ammunition box would empty in approximately 5 seconds of continuous fire. These numbers translated into overwhelming tactical advantages. Japanese. Pillboxes that could withstand suppression from conventional machine guns found themselves unable to maintain defensive fire when engaged by the Stinger. The sheer volume of round sporing through firing ports forced defenders to take cover, creating the precious seconds needed for demolition teams to advance. The Stinger that Grevich and Little assembled on Bougainville saw no combat during that campaign. The fighting concluded before they could properly test their creation in battle. But the weapon represented proof of concept, validation that aircraft machine guns could be successfully converted for infantry use with dramatic improvements in firepower. The Marine Parachute Battalions, despite their elite status and intensive training, were disbanded on February 29, 1944. The Paramarines had never conducted an actual combat jump. By late 1943, American strategists had concluded that large-scale airborne operations were impractical in the Pacific theater. The strategic geography of the Pacific imposed constraints that made airborne operations far less viable than in Europe. Pacific targets were smallest lands rather than continental landmasses. The typical island objective might be only a few miles across, offering limited drop zones and minimal space for airborne forces to operate independently. Most islands were so small that any airborne insertion would land forces within range of beach defenses, negating the primary advantage of vertical envelopment. Furthermore, the distances involved in Pacific operations created logistical challenges for airborne forces. European airborne operations could launch from relatively nearby bases, with transport aircraft returning to friendly airfields after dropping troops. Pacific operations required carriers or captured airfields thousands of miles from major bases. The specialized aircraft needed for parachute operations competed with bombers and transports for limited resources. The Navy, which controlled strategic movement in the Pacific, showed little enthusiasm for airborne operations that required dedicating aircraft and ships to specialized parachute units. Amphibious assault, the Navy's preferred method, allowed the concentration of overwhelming force at the point of attack with continuous naval gunfire support. Airborne forces, by contrast, would be isolated and vulnerable until ground forces could link up with them. The paramarines were scattered across the Fleet Marine Force, their expertise distributed among conventional units. This disbandment, while disappointing to the elite troops who had trained so hard for airborne operations, actually served to spread the paramarine culture of innovation and aggressive problem-solving throughout the Marine Corps. Milan Gravich found himself reassigned to the machine gun section of G Company, 28th Marine Regiment, 5th Marine Division. This reassignment would prove fortuitous, placing him in a position to revive and refine the Stinger concept for the most important battle of his life. The 5th Marine Division was activated on January 21, 1944 at Camp Pendleton, California. It was built around cadres from the disbanded parachute battalions, inheriting not just their personnel, but their culture of aggressive innovation and willingness to challenge conventional approaches. The division included the 26th, 27th, and 28th Marine Regiments, with the 28th receiving a disproportionate number of former Marines. From its inception, the division was slated for a major amphibious assault, though the specific target remained classified throughout much of their training throughout 1944. As the division trained at Camp Pendleton and later in Hawaii, rumors circulated about their eventual destination. Some speculated they would assault Formosa. Others believed they were bound for the Philippines or the China coast. The truth, when it finally came during classified briefings in late 1944, would prove more daunting than any rumor. The 5th Marine Division was bound for Iwo Jima, a volcanic speck in the Pacific that intelligence estimated would require 1 week to secure. The actual battle would last 36 days and demand more Marine blood than any battle in the Corps' history. When Gravich joined G Company in November 1944, their regiment was deep in training for Operation Detachment, the code name for the Iwo Jima invasion. The training regime was intense, focusing on the specific challenges of assaulting heavily fortified positions across difficult terrain. Mock beaches were constructed to simulate volcanic sand. Live fire exercises tested coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery. During these exercises, Gravich quickly grew frustrated with the performance of his company's light machine gun sections. The problem he had observed on Bougainville had not been solved. The Marine Corps had not fielded any new weapons that addressed the fundamental limitations of the M1919A6. Marines were still training with the same weapons, facing the same tactical constraints, accepting the same casualties that better equipment might prevent. During training exercises, Gravich watched as machine gun crews struggled to keep pace with advancing rifle platoon. He watched suppressive fire arrive too late to save Marines caught in killing zones. He saw demolition teams pinned down because machine guns could not deliver sufficient fire to suppress mock defensive positions. He knew a better solution existed because he had helped build it a year earlier on Bougainville. The memory of that first Stinger cobbled together in the field and never tested in combat nared at him. He had seen what the weapon could do in test firing. He had watched Cole's crude modification devastate a Japanese attack. He knew that properly engineered versions of the Stinger could give Marine rifle companies the firepower advantage they desperately needed. Gravich approached his company commander with a proposal. He could build modified aircraft machine guns, weapons that would give each platoon unprecedented firepower. The company commander, intrigued but cautious, understood that unauthorized modification of government property could result in court-martial. But he also understood that his Marines were training for an assault that would require every possible advantage. Their quest was passed up the chain of command to the battalion commander. Remarkably, perhaps reflecting the paramarine culture that permeated the 28th Marines, the battalion commander approved. This approval came with an important caveat that would prove crucial for Gravich's protection. The modifications were not officially sanctioned by Marine Corps headquarters. They were not part of any approved weapon system, not listed in any table of organization and equipment. Thestingers would not appear on any official property records, would not be subject to formal inspection, would exist in the gray area between field modification and unauthorized equipment. But they were authorized at the battalion level, a crucial distinction that would protect Gravich from charges of unauthorized modification of government property. The battalion commander put his approval in writing, creating a paper trail that legitimized the project within the battalion sphere of authority, even if it lacked higher-level sanction. This distinction might seem like bureaucratic hair-splitting, but it reflected a sophisticated understanding of military authority and responsibility. The battalion commander was essentially accepting personal responsibility for the modification program, betting his career on Gravich's ability to deliver effective weapons. Gravich set to work in Hawaii with the assistance of Private First Class John Little, his partner from the Bougainville Project. They scoured the island for crashed or damaged aircraft for spare parts from aircraft being cannibalized for other purposes for any source of AM-2 machine guns. Hawaii, as a major staging area for Pacific operations, hosted numerous air bases where damaged aircraft were evaluated for repair or salvage. The two Marines developed relationships with Navy and Marine Corps aviation personnel, explaining their project and requesting access to surplus weapons. Some aviation units were skeptical, questioning why ground troops wanted aircraft guns. Others were supportive, understanding that any innovation that might save Marine lives deserved support regardless of regulations. The construction process was meticulous despite the crude workshops available. Each stinger required precise cutting of M1 Garand stocks, careful fabrication of trigger mechanisms, exact fitting of Barbie pods and sights. The work could not be rushed. A poorly fitted stock might crack under recoil. An improperly fabricated trigger might fail at a critical moment. Sights had to be precisely aligned to ensure accuracy. The trigger mechanism presented the greatest technical challenge. Aircraft machine guns used solenoid triggers activated by electrical switches. Perfect for synchronized fire through propeller arcs, but useless for infantry work. The solenoid system required electrical power and offered no tactile feedback to the gunner. Gravich designed a simple mechanical trigger that could be fabricated from sheet metal and operated by finger pressure like a conventional rifle trigger. The mechanism needed to be strong enough to withstand repeated use and possible row handling in combat, but light enough that a gunner could maintain trigger control during sustained fire. The design went through several iterations before Gravich achieved the proper balance. Early versions were too stiff, requiring excessive finger pressure that made precise fire control difficult. Later versions were too light, creating the risk of accidental discharge. The final design used a carefully calculated spring tension that provided positive trigger feel without excessive pressure. The stock presented its own challenges. The M1 Garand stock was solid walnut designed to withstand the considerable recoil of the .306 cartridge. The wood's density and grain structure provided excellent strength, but also made it difficult to work with hand tools. To fit the AM2 Sunique receiver and buffer tube configuration, Gravich had to carefully hollow out the stock, removing wood while maintaining structural integrity. Too much material removed would weaken the stock, potentially causing catastrophic failure during firing. Too little material removed would prevent proper fit of the receiver. Grevich worked slowly and carefully, using chisels and files to remove wood incrementally, test-fitting the receiver repeatedly to ensure proper alignment and fit. The process for each stock took several days of patient work. The bipod and sight from the Browning automatic rifle required adapter fabrication. The mounting points on the bar components did not align with the AM2's configuration, necessitating custom-made brackets. These brackets had to be strong enough to maintain zero under thestrus of firing, but light enough not to significantly increase the weapon's overall weight. Grevich fabricated the brackets from steel plate, drilling and tapping mounting holes, bending metal to achieve proper angles, welding reinforcement where stress analysis indicated potential failure points. Each bracket was test-fitted, adjusted, and refitted until the bipod and sight mounted solidly with no play or movement. The work was painstaking, each stinger representing dozens of hours of skilled labor. But Grevich understood that lives would depend on these weapons. A malfunction in combat meant not just a failed weapon, but potentially dead Marines. Every weld had to be sound. Every fit had to be precise. Every component had to be tested and verified. By January 1945, as the 5th Marine Division prepared to board ships for the journey to Iwo Jima, Grevich had completed 6 Stingers. Each weapon had been test-fired extensively, adjusted and refined until it functioned reliably. The testing revealed the fundamental limitation that would constrain Stinger employment in combat. The overheating problem inherent in the thin aircraft barrel could not be eliminated. Without the cooling effect of aircraft slipstream, the barrel would grow dangerously hot after sustained fire. Extended firing could actually cause the barrel to warp or even melt, rendering the weapon useless. Grevich trained his gunners in strict fire discipline. Short bursts only, 3 to 5 seconds maximum, allowing the barrel to cool between engagements. This discipline was absolutely critical. An overheated Stinger was worse than no Stinger at all, as it represented wasted weight, and a gunner who could have been carrying a conventional weapon. The 6 guns represented countless hours of work, materials acquired through unofficial channels, modifications that existed, in a gray area between innovation and regulation. But they were also exactly what the 28th Marines needed for Iwo Jima. The weapons offered firepower that no other rifle company in the division could match. The distribution of the 6 Stingers was carefully considered. 1 went to each of G Company's 3 rifle platoon, providing each with organic firepower that exceeded their authorized weapons. The platoon commanders received special briefings on employment tactics, learning how to maximize the Stinger's capabilities, while managing its limitations. 1 gun went to the company's demolition section, where it would provide covering fire for engineers attacking fortified positions. The 5th gun kept for himself, taking personal responsibility for employing the weapon he had created. The 6th Stinger went to a Marine from a company 28th Marines. His name was Tony Stein, and his actions with this weapon would help him earn the nation's highest decoration for valor. Tony Stein was born on September 30th, 1921 in Dayton, Ohio, to immigrant parents from Austria, Hungary. His parents had come to America seeking opportunity and freedom from the political instability of Central Europe. They settled in Dayton, part of the wave of Eastern European immigration that transformed American industrial cities in the early 20th century. The Stein family struggled financially, particularly during the Great Depression. When economic hardship forced difficult choices, Tony dropped out of high school during his freshman year. This was not uncommon during the Depression, when family survival often required every able-bodied person to work. Education was a luxury that many families simply could not afford. Tony found work where he could, eventually securing an apprenticeship as a toolmaker. This training proved far more valuable than any academic education he might have received. Tool making in the 1930s required understanding of precision measurement, material properties, machine operation, and manufacturing processes. A skilled toolmaker needed to read technical drawings, calculate tolerances, operate lathes and milling machines, and create precisely fabricated components. The work demanded patience, attention to detail, and problem-solving ability. Toolmakers created the specialized tools and dies used in mass production, meaning their work had to be absolutely precise. An error of a few thousandth of an inch could render an entire production run unusable. This training gave Stein hands-on experience with metal fabrication remarkably similar to what would be required to modify aircraft machine guns. He understood stress points and material tolerances. He knew how to fabricate custom components. He had the practical knowledge to look at a piece of equipment and understand how it could be modified or improved. When war came, Stein did not wait for the draft. On September 22, 1942, shortly before his 21st birthday, he enlisted in the Marine Corps Reserve. The timing was significant. By September 1942, America had been at war for nearly 10 months. The initial wave of patriotic volunteers had already enlisted. The reality of war's cost was becoming clear through casualty reports from Guadalcanal and other early Pacific battles. Stein knew what he was volunteering for. The Marines had a reputation for getting the hardest assignments, for going in first, for suffering the highest casualties. He wanted to defend his country, and he wanted to do it where the fighting was fiercest. This decision revealed key aspects of his character. A willingness to face danger, a sense of duty that transcended personal safety, a belief that his country's defense required his service regardless of risk. Stein's recruit training at the Marine Corps Recruit Depot San Diego marked him as exceptional. The training was deliberately brutal, designed to break down civilian habits and build Marine discipline. Physical conditioning pushed recruits to their limits. Marksmanship training demanded precision. Close order drill instilled instant obedience to commands. Some recruits barely survived this training. Others excelled, demonstrating the physical toughness, mental resilience, and leadership potential that marked them for elite assignments. Stein impressed his drill instructors sufficiently to be selected for Marine parachute training at Camp Gillespie. The Paramarine selection was an honor, but it also meant volunteering for even more demanding training. Parachute school had a high washout rate. The physical requirements were extreme, the training dangerous, the discipline stricter than conventional Marine units. Those who completed the course joined an elite brotherhood characterized by exceptional esprit. Though the Paramarines never jumped into combat, their training created Marines of unusual capability and initiative. The curriculum emphasized independent thinking, small unit tactics, and adaptability. Paramarines were expected to operate behind enemy lines with minimal support, which required soldiers who could think for themselves and solve problems without detailed orders. When the parachute battalions disbanded, Stein was promoted to corporal and assigned to the 5th Marine Division, serving as assistant squad leader of Company A, 1st Battalion, 28th Marines. His toolmaker skills made him invaluable for weapons maintenance and modification. In any infantry unit, there are always weapons that need adjustment, sights that need alignment, magazines that need tuning. When word spread through the 28th Marines about Gravich's Stinger project, Stein's skills and interest made him a natural collaborator. The exact nature of his involvement remains unclear in historical records. Some sources suggest he assisted with fabrication of multiple Stingers. Others indicate he primarily worked on modifying his own weapon. What is certain is that Stein ended up with the 6th Stinger, the weapon that would help him earn the Medal of Honor. The relationship between Stein and his Stinger represented more than simply a soldier being issued a weapon. Stein understood the weapon intimately because he had helped create it. He knew its capabilities and limitations, knew exactly how hard he could push it before overheating became critical, knew the precise sight picture required for accurate fire. This intimate knowledge would prove crucial during the desperate fighting on Iwo Jima, where Stein would employ the Stinger with a tactical sophistication that maximized its unique capabilities. The journey to Iwo Jima began in January 1945 as the 5th Marine Division, along with the 3rd and 4th. Marine divisions boarded transport ships in Hawaii. Approximately 70,000 Marines and attached Navy personnel crowded onto transports that would carry them 2,000 miles west across the Pacific. The men knew their destination by now. Security restrictions had been relaxed enough to allow detailed briefings. Marines studied aerial photographs of Iwo Jima, a pork chop-shaped island dominated by Mount Suribachi on its southern tip. The island measured roughly 5 mi long and 1 to 2 mi at its widest point, comprising approximately 8 square miles of volcanic rock and ash. Intelligence officers explained the island's strategic importance using maps and charts. Iwo Jima sat roughly 750 mi south of Tokyo, positioned between the newly captured Marianas and the Japanese home islands. In American hands, the island's airfields could serve multiple critical functions. B-29. Superfortress bombers flying from the Marianas to Japan operated at the extreme edge of their range. Any damages sustained over the target meant potentially ditching in the ocean during the long flight home. Iwo Jima would provide an emergency landing strip where damaged bombers could land for repairs rather than attempting the full return flight. The island could also base fighter escorts for the bombers. The P-51 Mustang had sufficient range to accompany B-29s to Japan and back if it could refuel at Iwo Jima. Fighter escort would dramatically improve bomber survival rates against Japanese air defenses. Finally, Iwo Jima would serve as a launching point for the eventual invasion of Japan itself, providing advanced bases for air support, logistics, and command facilities. But what the intelligence officers could not fully convey was the sophistication of the Japanese defenses. Intelligence estimates based on aerial reconnaissance and submarine observations significantly underestimated both the strength of the garrison and the extent of fortifications. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, assigned to defend Iwo Jima in June 1944, had 9 months to prepare. A career officer with extensive combat experience in China and strategic studies at the Army War College, Kuribayashi understood both the tactical and strategic aspects of warfare situation and the strategic reality facing Japan. He recognized that Japan had already lost the war. American industrial production, military strength, and technological superiority made Japanese defeat inevitable. But the timing and terms of that defeat remained in question. If Japan could make the cost of invasion sufficiently horrific, if American casualties mounted high enough, political pressure might force negotiation rather than unconditional surrender. Kuribayashi's mission was not victory, but delay. Not to defend Iwo Jima successfully, but to make the Americans pay such a terrible price that they might reconsider invading the Japanese home islands. He approached this mission with cold calculation and innovative defensive doctrine. Traditional Japanese defensive strategy called for fighting at the water's edge, meeting invaders on the beaches and destroying them before they could establish a foothold. This approach had achieved some success in earlier campaigns, but had proven increasingly ineffective against American amphibious capability. Naval gunfire and air support could devastate beach defenses, and American armor could break through positions that stopped infantry. Kuribayashi abandoned this traditional approach entirely. He ordered his 21,000 troops to dig into burrow into Iwo Jima's volcanic rock to create an underground fortress that could withstand even the heaviest bombardment. His men excavated 18-kilometer off-tunnels, creating an interconnected network of fighting positions, supply depots, and command posts. They constructed hundreds of concealed pillboxes using reinforced concrete and volcanic rock. These positions were masterfully camouflaged, invisible from the air and nearly invisible from ground level until Marines were almost on top of them. Each position was sited to provide interlocking fields of fire, ensuring that attackers who neutralized one position would immediately be engaged by others. Artillery and mortar positions were constructed in caves and covered bunkers, allowing Japanese gunners to fire on prearranged targets, then retreat into cover before counter-battery fire could respond. Pre-registered firing points covered every likely avenue of approach, every beach, every terrain feature that attacking forces might use for cover. Kuribayashi trained his men in a new defensive doctrine that rejected the banzai charges and suicidal attacks that had characterized earlier Japanese resistance. There would be no wasteful gestures of honor, no dramatic but tactically meaningless attacks. Every man would fight from cover, fire only when targets presented themselves, inflict maximum casualties while preserving their own lives as long as possible. Each defender was instructed to kill 10 Americans before dying himself. Positions would be defended to the last man, but defenders would not throw away their lives in useless attacks. They would make the Americans dig them out one position at a time, paying in blood for every yard of volcanic rock. The discipline required to implement this doctrine was extraordinary. Traditional Japanese military culture emphasized aggressive offensive action, glorious death in battle, and honor through sacrifice. Kuribayashi was asking his men to abandon these deeply ingrained values, to accept that they would all die, but die in ways that maximized enemy casualties, rather than personal glory. That, he succeeded in imposing this discipline on his command, speaks to both his leadership ability and the desperate circumstances Japan faced by early 1945. The men defending Iwo Jima understood they were doomed, that no reinforcement would come, that the best they could hope for was to die in ways that served Japan's final defense. The pre-invasion bombardment began on February 16, 1945. Major General Harry Schmidt, commanding the Marine Forces, had requested 10 days of naval bombardment based on intelligence estimates of Japanese defensive strength. He understood from bitter experience that reducing fortified positions required sustained fire over days, not hours. The Navy provided 3 days. This decision reflected both the strategic demands of the broader Pacific campaign and fundamental misunderstanding of the defensive preparations on Iwo Jima Naval. Planners believed that 3 days of concentrated fire from battleships, cruisers, and destroyers would be sufficient to neutralize defensive positions and suppress remaining resistance. For 72 hours, the most powerful naval task force ever assembled pounded Iwo Jima. Battleships firing 16-inch guns hurled shells weighing more than a ton into volcanic rock. Cruisers added 8-inch fire. Destroyers maneuvered close inshore to engage specific targets with 5-inch guns. The bombardment was staggering in scale. Thousands of shells crashed into these land every hour. Entire sections of terrain disappeared under explosions. Volcanic rock shattered and sprayed across the landscape. From the transport ships where Marines waited, the island seemed to be disintegrating under the weight of fire. B-29 bombers flew strikes from the Marianas, adding heavy bombs to the naval gunfire. Navy aircraft from fast carriers attacked systematically, bombing and strafing any visible targets. The combined firepower represented the most concentrated bombardment yet delivered against a Pacific island. The Marines watching from their transports felt confident. Nothing could survive that bombardment. Intelligence estimates predicted 1 week to secure the island. A few officers privately speculated they might wrap up operations in 3 or 4 days. They were catastrophically wrong. The bombardment, while visually impressive, was largely ineffective against Kuribayashi's underground fortress. Naval shells designed to penetrate ship armor or destroy surface structures had limited effect on positions dug deep into volcanic rock. Bombs created impressive craters but failed to collapse the tunnel networks beneath. The Japanese, following Kuribayashi's orders, remained in their underground positions throughout the bombardment. They did not return fire, did not reveal their positions, did not give the American gunners any targets to engage. The Americans were in many cases bombarding empty terrain, while the actual defensive positions remained untouched deep underground. When the bombardment lifted on the morning of February 19th, Kuribayashi's forces emerged from their tunnels largely intact. Weapons functional, ammunition stocks undepleted, defensive positions still viable. The 3 days of bombardment had accomplished little beyond alerting the defenders that the invasion was imminent. February 19, 1945, dawned clear and cold. Hour was it for 9:00 in the morning. The 1st Assault Wave, 5th Marine Division on the left, 4th Marine Division on the right, would land across 700 yards of beach designated Green Beach, Red Beach, Yellow Beach, and Blue Beach from south to north. As the Amtraks churned towards Hor carrying their loads of Marines, the men could see Mount Suribachi looming ahead, a dormant volcano 554 ft, dominating the southern end of the island. Naval gunfire shifted inland as the first wave approached the beach, and an eerie silence fell over Iwo Jima. The Marines hit the beach at precisely Kauk and immediately encountered their first obstacle. The beach was not sand in the traditional sense, but volcanic ash, black and loose, rising in terraces 15 ft high. Men sank to their ankles with every step. Some sank to their knees. The volcanic ash provided nostable footing, no firm surface for digging in or establishing firing positions. Vehicles bogged down immediately. Tanks and Amtraks that attempted to climb the beach. Terraces found their treads spinning uselessly in the loose. Ash equipment that was supposed to move inland to support the advancing infantry became stuck within yards of the waterline. The Marines clawed their way forward, expecting Japanese fire at any moment. The silence continued, broken only by the sound of naval gunfire falling inland and the labored breathing of men struggling through volcanic ash. Officers checked their watches nervously. The lack of resistance felt wrong, ominous. For nearly an hour, the Japanese held their fire, following Kuribayashi's orders to the letter. Let the Americans land. Let them crowd onto the beach. Let them struggle forward, bringing more and more men into the killing zone. Wait until the maximum number of targets presented themselves. Wait until the beach was packed with men and equipment. Wait until a single command could unleash hell. At approximately 10 Kwarkaung, when the beach was crowded with men and vehicles, when Marines were struggling through the ash, unable to advance quickly or take effective cover, when thousands of Americans were packed into the confined space between the waterline and the first terrace, the entire island erupted. Artillery and mortar fire fell in devastating concentrations, pre-registered fires that had been plotted weeks in advance. High explosive shells burst among the packed Marines, sending fragments tearing through flesh and equipment. Mortar rounds dropped into the volcanic ash with dull crunches before exploding. Machine guns fired from hidden positions in the terraces, from concealed pillboxes, from firing ports so skillfully camouflaged that Marines could not locate them even while taking fire. The interlocking fields of fire that Kuribayashi had so carefully planned meant that attackers who sought cover from one position immediately exposed themselves to fire from another. Marines died in the black volcanic sand, cut down by fire they could not see from positions they could not locate, delivered by an enemy that remained invisible. The pre-invasion bombardment, which was supposed to have neutralized defensive positions, had barely scratched Kuribayashi's defenses. Men tried to dig in, but the loose volcanic ash collapsed faster than they could excavate. Wounded Marines sank into the ash, sometimes disappearing entirely. Corpsmen trying to treat casualties became casualties themselves. Officers attempting to organize advances were cut down by machine gun fire. The 28th Marines, landing on the extreme left of the assault beaches, had orders to drive south and isolate Mount Suribachi. This mission put them directly under fire from the volcano's slopes where Kuribayashi had positioned some of his strongest defenses. Tony Stein was the first man from his unit to move inland after hitting the beach. While others sought cover or struggled with equipment in the chaotic moments after landing, Stein advanced carrying his Stinger. The weapon's 25 lb weight light for a machine gun allowed him to move quickly despite the treacherous terrain. As the rest of his platoon attempted to establish a foothold, Stein provided covering fire with the Stinger. The weapon's incredible rate of fire shocked both sides. Japanese defenders who had faced Browning machine guns throughout the Pacific War suddenly encountered something entirely different. A continuous roar that poured rounds at unprecedented rates. The sound was distinctive and terrifying. Where the Browning created a rhythmic hammering, the Stinger produced a tearing roar, like canvas being ripped apart at enormous speed. The volume of fire was so high that it created visible traces streaming toward targets, looking almost like a solid line of fire. When Stein's comrades became pinned down by concentrated machine gun and mortar fire, he made a decision that defied every survival instinct. He stood upright, completely exposed, deliberately drawing Japanese fire to himself. This was not reckless bravado, but tactical calculation born from training and combat instinct. By exposing himself, Stein forced the Japanese to reveal their positions by firing at him. The muzzle flashes, the puffs of dust kicked up by firing, the slight movement of camouflage being disturbed. All these things became visible when the Japanese engaged such a prominent target. Once he located hostile guns, Stein could engage them with the Stinger. The weapon proved devastatingly effective against pillboxes. Its high rate of fire allowed Stein to pour enough rounds into firing ports to suppress or eliminate the defenders inside. A 3-second burst sent 75 rounds into a space perhaps 18 in square. A concentration of fire that gave defenders no opportunity to return fire effectively. Stein charged Japanese pillboxes one by one, firing the Stinger from the hip in short, controlled bursts. The technique required tremendous upper body strength and weapon control. The Stinger, despite its relatively light weight, generated significant recoil when firing at 200 rounds per minute. Maintaining aim while advancing required strength, skill, and absolute focus. The Stinger consumed ammunition at an alarming rate. Despite Stein's discipline in using short bursts rather than sustained fire, he rapidly exhausted his supply. The weapon's primary limitation, its prodigious appetite for ammunition, became critical in sustained combat. When the Stinger ran dry, Stein made a decision that combined courage with practical necessity. He kicked off his shoes and threw down his helmet, items that would slow him down, and ran back to the beach to retrieve ammunition.